Good morning. My name is Ashley, and today we will be talking about adolescent bereavement, more specifically, what happens to a young person's development when a parent dies.
Let me start out with some definitions because the term parental bereavement kind of gets used loosely. For the purpose of this presentation, parental bereavement means that the death of one or both parents before the child reaches adulthood, which I'm just going to say is 18. And that distinction matters because losing a parent at the age of 35 is a painful life event, while losing a parent at 14 is a developmental disruption. And it interrupts work the young person is actively in the middle of doing. So the scope is research indicates that approximately 3 to 5% of children in the United States will lose a parent before age 18. Depending on how you count, that represents somewhere between 1.5 and 3.5 million young people, according to Gray and colleagues in 2011. Now, why focus on adolescence in particular rather than childhood in generality? Because adolescence is the most identity sensitive stretch of human development. This is the period when a person is actively working on who they are, what they believe, what they value, and where they're headed. And that work leans heavily on the psychological scaffolding a parent provides, the modeling, the guidance, the emotional security, the simple reliability of someone being there. Parental death pulls that scaffolding away at precisely the moment it is carrying the most weight. To trace that out properly, I will examine outcomes across four developmental stages: middle childhood, early adolescence from 10 to 14, and late adolescence from 15 to 19, and emerging adults from 18 through, let's say, mid 20s and older than that. At each stage, I will look at identity, mental health, academics, relationships, and long-term adjustments.
So I chose three theoretical frameworks that will kind of carry the rest of the conversation. And I chose them deliberately because each one answers a different question about what parental loss actually does. Erickson answers the question of why adolescence specifically. His fifth psychosocial stage, identity versus role confusion, spans roughly between the ages of 12 to 18, and its central task is the formation of a coherent sense of self. Adolescence needs room to experiment who they might become, and parental death can collapse that room entirely. Worden's answers the question of what grieving actually involves. Rather than describing passive stages that happen to a person, Worden frames mourning as four active tasks, and these are things the bereaved person has to do. The distinction matters enormously for adolescents, because their cognitive and social immaturity can block that from completing those tasks, which is how grief stalls rather than resolves. And Bronfenner answers the question of where the damage spreads. His bioecological model reminds us that a death does not happen at the edge of the family. It travels outward through school, through community, and through culture, and every one of those layers either amplifies the harm or absorbs some of it. Taken together, these three gives us why, a what, and a where. Everything I present after this connection comes back to them. Okay, we're going to move on to Worden's four tasks of mourning. Worden's model gives us the secondary framework here, and its central claim is that mourning is something a person does, not and merely just something a person experiences. That is a meaningful departure from the stage models most people are familiar with, such as Kubler and Ross, and it matters here because tasks can be blocked, and adolescence blocks all four of them in specific ways. Task one is accepting the reality of the loss. Now, that sounds pretty self-evident, but younger adolescents are still thinking fairly concretely at that stage, and the abstract finality of death is generally difficult for them to hold on to. They may understand it intellectually on Monday and expect the parent to be home on Friday. Task two is processing the pain of grief, allowing the sadness, the anger, the guilt, and the confusion to actually be felt. But here is the adolescent specific complication. Teenagers routinely mask grief in order to appear normal in front of their peers. Fitting in is developmentally urgent at this age, and grief makes a person visibly different. So they suppress it, which actively prevents this task from being completed at all. Task three is adjusting to a world without the deceased. New roles, new routines, new responsibilities. For a bereaved adolescent, these usually arrive years earlier than they otherwise would have, and they arrive at the direct expense of a young person's own developmental work. Task four is finding an enduring connection. Not letting go of the parent, but carrying the relationship forward internally while they still reinvesting and living. Warden considers this the marker of a healthy long-term adjustment. We're going to move on to how loss ripples across the ecological system. Bronfender's biological model is the third framework I chose, and I chose it because it explains why two adolescents can experience the same loss but end up on completely different trajectories. The microsystem is the family, and this is the layer that matters the most. The surviving parent's mental health, whether daily routines hold together, whether the household stays financially stable, and how siblings respond all shape this outcome. The mesosystem is the connection between home and school. After a death, attendance slips, nobody is monitoring homework, and the communication between teachers and parents goes quiet exactly at the moment it is needed the most. The exosystem is the surrounding community, whether grief support groups exist, whether the school has a counselor, whether there is accessible mental health care. The macro system is culture, norms about expressing grief, stigma around visible mourning, and the strength of economic safety nets determine whether an adolescent is even permitted to grieve openly. And the chronal system itself is the age at which the loss occurred and how long ago it happened. Watson and Hayward emphasize that timing moderates nearly every long-term outcome. So the point of all this is simple. No bereaved adolescent grieves in a vacuum. So we're going to begin with the adolescent developmental stages with middle childhood, which is ages between 6 and 10. I chose to begin here because by this age, the disruption already has a running start. Cognitively, children in this range are only beginning to consolidate what death actually is. They're working out that it's permanent, that it's universal and happens to everybody, and that the body genuinely just stops functioning. And critically, they listen, literally. The euphemisms we reach for as adults, like passed away, we lost him, he's sleeping, create real confusion rather than comfort. Warden is very direct about this. He said concrete, plain language is the kinder choice with children at this age, even though it feels harsher to say. Grief at this stage surfaces in behavior rather than in words. What adults see is separation anxiety, sleep disturbances, clinginess and headaches and stomach aches with no medical cause, and regression to behaviors the child had already outgrown. These children are not refusing to talk about it, they simply do not yet have the vocabulary to name what is happening inside of them. In Bowlby's terms, the attachment system at this age is entirely caregiver dependent. The parent is not one source of security among many, the parent is the secure base. This is precisely why the surviving parent's functioning becomes the strongest single predictor of how the child goes from there.
Let's take a look how early loss shapes the self. Now, identity formation has barely begun at this stage, which means the loss removes the primary model for who this young person is becoming. That is, the self is left without a foundational mirror. Academic disruption starts almost immediately. Berg and colleagues documented concentration failures, absenteeism, and teacher-reported behavioral problems within months of the death. Socially, these adolescents describe profound isolation because peers cannot relate, so they feel different and stigmatized, cut off from ordinary adolescent life at the exact age when fitting in matters enormously. But the finding I'd underline is the surviving parent's mental health is the number one predictor of outcomes. Melham found that parental depression roughly doubles the risk of a psychiatric disorder in the child.
The next phase is early adolescence, which is between the ages of 10 to 14. And what defines this phase is basically a collision between cognitive immaturity and profound loss. Their thinking is still largely concrete, which means the permanence and universality of death remain hard to fully grasp. Magical thinking can persist, and some of these young people generally expect their parent to come back. The appropriate response to this is patient, repeated psychoeducation rather than correction, because they're not being irrational here, they're being 10. And role reversal appears early in this phase. These adolescents take on parentified roles, caring for the surviving parent or for their siblings, and that directly interrupts their own developmental tasks. Kate found that this is especially pronounced in daughters who lost a mother. The family often experiences this as the child being mature and helpful, which is exactly why it goes unaddressed for so long. Grief also becomes physical at this age. You've got stomach aches, headaches, separation anxiety, school refusal, and regression to earlier behaviors, which are all common. The body carries what the mind cannot yet put into words. And underneath all that is Balby's attachment system that has been activated. Early adolescents still depend heavily on parents as the secure base, and the sudden removal of that base destabilizes their core capacity for emotional regulation, which could show up as chronic hyperarousal or disassociation. Now we'll take a look at late adolescence, which is the phase between ages 15 to 19. And this is where the identity crisis is most acute. Formal operational thinking has arrived by this stage, which means that these adolescents can now fully grasp and confront what death means. The abstraction of it, the permanence, the implication for their own mortality. The crisis is sharper here precisely because they finally understand what has happened to them. Comprehension is not comfort, though. On identity, this is Erickson and Marcia's in practice. Bereaved teens skip the moratorium and either foreclose, taking on the deceased parental role and responsibility as a permanent identity, or they diffuse, withdrawing and drifting without committing to anything. On academics, Berg and colleagues found bereaved adolescents withdrawing from school earlier and reporting significantly lower educational aspirations. By wave 3 of the AdHealth data, they had completed a full year less education than the non-bereaved peers. 1 year of education attributed to the loss. On risk behavior, Gray and colleagues found an odds ratio of 1.79 for substance use with a confidence interval of 1.36 to 2.36, along with an odds ratio of 1.35 for behavioral disengagement and higher rates of sexual behavior. And socially, these adolescents report feeling isolated from peers, their primary social world, while family cohesion drops at the same time because the surviving parent is coping with their own grief. Both support systems weaken simultaneously here. Now let's go over the research findings, and I put the data side by side because I want you to see these four figures together, a pattern emergence that I think is kind of easy to miss. So the substance use risk carries an odds ratio of 1.79 compared with non-bereaved peers. Depressive symptoms run roughly double, and Gray found that showing up within 2 weeks, 2 months of the death. Educational attainment falls by about 1 full year by emerging adulthood. And Hochschlingus and Smith found that parental death before age 19 is associated with significantly elevated suicide risk in adulthood, with the effect especially pronounced for females. Here's what I want you to notice. These four findings describe two distinct kinds of harm running on two very different clocks. The first is acute, it's psychiatric, it appears within weeks, and it's highly visible. Depression, substance use, and crisis, that is the harm we recognize as grief. The second is structural. It is the educational, economic, and relational. It unfolds across decades and is almost invisible in the moment. Nobody sees a year of lost education happening. And our support systems are built almost entirely for the first kind. We offer counseling in the weeks after death and that we close the file. The harm is still accumulating 10 years later, and nobody is watching. So phase 3 is emerging adulthood, which are ages between 18 through mid 20s and beyond. And this is where the story gets generally more complicated because it contains real recovery and real damage at the same time. So let's start with recovery because it's significant here. Milham and colleagues found that bereaved youth showed psychiatric improvements approximating community controls by about 62 months post-loss, which is roughly around 5 years. And the most acute symptoms, depression, suicidality, conduct problems, moderate through natural resilient process. This is a measurable, meaningful recovery, and it deserves to be stated plainly. But recovery and opportunity diverge, and that is the central point of this slide. The AdHealth data shows more bereaved young adults living in homeless shelters, being evicted, having their utilities shut off, and being denied credit. And crucially, that held even after controlling for race and social class, which means this disadvantage is attributed to the loss itself rather than to who these families already were before the death. Relationally, bereaved women were significantly less likely to have married by their late 20s and 30s, while bereaved men were more likely to be living alone. The isolation pattern extends across both genders but expresses itself differently. So the psychiatric symptoms resolve while the maternal and relational disadvantages persist. Feeling better and doing better are not the same outcome. I want to stay in the emerging adulthood development stage for a moment longer and look at specifically relationships, identity, and the long tail of physical health. Pure attachment deficits were still measurable at 62 and Milham's data, significantly lower attachment scores than non-bereaved controls 5 years after the death. And romantic commitment is often delayed, which researchers link either to a fear of experiencing another loss or the insecure attachment patterns that form at the time of the death. Identity work does not finish here either. Many bereaved young adults describe continuing to reorganize what the parent's death means within their own life story. Well into their 20s and 30s, the narrative keeps getting rewritten as they reach milestones the parent will not see. Hunglius and Smith also found elevated cardiovascular disease risk in adulthood following early parental death, which suggests that stress of the loss leaves a physiological legacy carried in the body, not in the mind. And alongside of all that, I don't want to skip the growth because it is well documented. Bereaved young adults reported increased compassion, maturity beyond their peers, and stronger sense of purpose and spirituality growth. A striking number are drawn into helping professionals, counseling, social work, and nursing, specifically because of what they went through. They carry both wounds and wisdom, and the honest account of the literature has that to include both. So let's explore the critical and moderating variables of the sex of the deceased parent. So, okay, everything that we have talked about so far has treating parental death as a single category of an event, and it's not. Outcomes differ substantially depending on whether the adolescent loses a mother or a father, and those effects are shaped further by the sex of the child. Start with the base rates. Fitzgerald and colleagues found that 68% of first parental deaths during adolescence are paternal, and 32% are maternal. So father loss is the more common experience by a wide margin. Maternal loss produces stronger and more persistent depressive symptoms, with trajectories peaking around age 20 and remaining elevated long term. Parental loss most acutely disrupts short-term educational attainment and mental health, and those effects are especially pronounced in boys. Same-sex parents' loss is uniquely destabilizing because the adolescent loses their primary gender role model at the most identity-sensitive point in their development. That is Erikson's fifth stage again, but with the specific model for who this young person was becoming removed from the picture. And then there is the outlier. Berg and colleagues found that maternal death from external causes carries a hazardous ratio of 3.23 for depression hospitalization in male children. This is the highest hazard ratio in the entire literature review and in this presentation. So we're going to look at how parent sex shapes grief outcomes. And this slide breaks down the interaction into the four cells. And I did this because I want to read them together rather than one at a time because the pattern only appears when you compare them. So boys who lose a father show significant drops in short-term educational attainment, higher long-term risk of criminal behavior, and reduced adult income, and the loss of a primary role model that Erikson details in stage 5 identity work. Boys who lose a mother show acute mental health disorientation in the immediate aftermath. And this is the group carrying the hazard ratio of 3.23 when the death involved external causes. Note that the explanation researchers offer for this is the surviving father is often less emotionally equipped to compensate, which amplifies the child's vulnerability rather than buffering it. Girls who lose a father show significantly reduced high school completion and elevated risks of teen pregnancy, which researchers interpret as early partner seeking, filling a parental attachment void. Girls who lose a mother show the most prevalent role reversal in household caregiving and the most persistent depressive trajectory of any group on this slide. And here the research is explicit that closeness with the surviving father is the critical protective buffer. Now, read the last two rows together because something jumped out at me. In both of the high-risk cells, the outcome hinges on the father. When he can show up, the child is buffered. When he cannot, the child carries it alone. Which raises the obvious question, what condition is he actually in? That is the next slide, and it is the one I most want you to remember actually in this presentation. Now we're going to examine the double burden, and this finding is what reframed the entire topic for me. When a mother dies, there is a second bereavement hidden inside the first one, and almost nobody names it. The father now has to grieve his wife and parent his children simultaneously, usually without the emotional resources to do either one well. The data on how this goes is striking. In Yope and colleagues' study of 252 widowed fathers, 45% of them still exceeded clinical thresholds for depression 2 full years after their wife died. The mean depression score was 22.6 against a clinical cutoff of 16. An earlier cohort of 259 widowed fathers put that figure above 65%. So these are not just men in acute crisis in the first week. These are men who have quietly stayed in it for years. But many are also drinking. Roughly 30% of bereaved adults screen positive for problematic alcohol use, far above general population rates, and men disproportionately use alcohol as their primary grief coping strategy, in part because social norms actively discourage them from seeking emotional help. But prolonged grief independently raises that risk, and co-occurring depression compounds it even further. And here's what it does to their parenting. These fathers consistently report meeting the practical duties, the meals made, um, the rides given, forms signed, while describing themselves as simply going through the motions. So warmth declines, consistency declines, emotional availability declines. The house still runs, but the person inside it is gone. Yope found that this impairment most severe in younger fathers and those without a partner, and it stays elevated across the 2 full years of observation window. So let's follow the cascade for the adolescent. They lose their mother, then they functionally lose the emotional presence of their father, and then, because Milham identified surviving caregiver mental health as the single strongest predictor of childhood outcomes, their own risk roughly doubles. One death produces 3 losses, which is why I would argue that the highest leveraged intervention in this entire field is not a program for children at all. Treating the widowed father is treating the child. All right, let's move on to implications. And what do we actually do with all of this? First, screen early and screen often. Gray's data supports assessing bereaved adolescents for depression, substance use, and identity disruption within weeks of the death, not months. The 2-month depression finding tells us that window opens immediately. Second, support the surviving caregiver. If caregiver mental health is the strongest predictor of childhood outcomes, then treating the parent is treating the child. This is not a supplementary intervention. Based on what we have just seen about widowed father, it is arguably the central one, and it is the one we are most consistently failing to deliver. Third, match the intervention to developmental phase. Early adolescents need concrete grief psychoeducation. Late adolescents need identity support therapy, meaning cognitive, behavioral, and narrative approaches. Emerging adults need socioeconomic and relational support because that is where their disadvantage actually lives. Fourth, invest in school-based grief programs. In the bioecological terms, the school is critical mesosystem buffer, and school nurses and counselors are the frontline responders, whether or not we have trained for them or not. Fifth, normalize grief expression among peers because adolescents who can grieve openly with friends show significantly better adjustment outcomes. And 6, plan for long-term follow-up because the socioeconomic and relational disadvantages persist into the 30s. Support that ends at the funeral or at the end of the school year ends decades too early. Grief is not a problem to be solved. It is a developmental challenge to be supported. So where does this leave us? Let me bring this back to where we started. Parental loss during adolescence is a developmental event, not merely an emotional one. It reaches identity, education, relationship, physical health, and economic standing, and for some young people, it does so for decades rather than months. But trajectory is not destiny, and the research points at a specific lever. The surviving parent's functioning is the strongest predictor we have on how a bereaved child turns out, which means caregiver support is not a supplementary intervention. It is the central one. And the widowed father literature shows that this lever is being almost entirely ignored. Nearly half of these men are still clinically depressed 2 years after the wife died, and we are not screening them, not treating them, and not even asking. We screen the children. We ignore the men raising them. If we supported widow fathers the way we support their children, we would be intervening on the single strongest predictor in the entire field. This is the argument I would leave with you. Let me close by pointing you to the source behind it.